I sat in that cold, mahogany-paneled office as the will was read, already knowing what was coming, but it didn't make it hurt any less. Everything went to my brother. Everything. The company, the estates, the wealth. Me? I got family photos and a pat on the head. As if my years of effort, my loyalty, my existence meant nothing, betrayed, discarded, and humiliated, just as they always intended. But they had no idea. I wasn't finished yet. The mahogany-paneled office smelled of leather and old money. A place where power had always been decided with signatures and sealed envelopes. I sat still, hands folded in my lap, while my brother Damien leaned back in his chair, exuding the smug confidence of a man who had never known loss. The lawyer cleared his throat, reading the words that would finalize my father's last insult. The properties at 1542 Oak Ridge, 902 Lenox Drive, and the Aspen Estate, all to Damien Morgan. The Morgan Corporation and all its subsidiaries, also to Damien Morgan. I barely heard the rest. The words weren't a shock. They were just confirmation of what I had always known. I was never meant to inherit anything. Not in my father's eyes. Freya Morgan, marine biologist, environmentalist, the daughter who disappointed him at every turn. He groomed Damien to be his successor while dismissing my passions as childish idealism. That's all? Damien finally asked, his smirk widening. Oh, wait, let me guess. She gets Mom's recipe box? Laughter. Even the lawyer chuckled, but I simply smiled, because while they celebrated my defeat, they had no idea I was already holding the real victory in my hands. They just didn't know it yet. The air in the lawyer's office felt thick, suffocating, as the weight of my father's final words settled over me. The empire he built, the wealth he amassed, every last asset, handed over to my brother Damien. Just as expected. What I hadn't expected was the final blow. And lastly, to Freya Morgan, a personal effects account containing family photographs and a few sentimental items. Damien snorted. Well, Frey, at least you get the old photo albums. Not sure where you'll put them in that tiny shack you call home. His words, dripping with mock sympathy, sent a sharp pang through my chest. I clenched my hands beneath the table, my nails digging into my palm, forcing myself to remain calm. The lawyer cleared his throat. There is one additional note. Your father expressed his hope that you'd reconsider your choices. Should you ever decide to abandon your environmental distractions and return to the corporate world, Damien has been instructed to find you a position within Morgan Enterprises. I let out a short, humorless laugh. Of course, even in death, my father saw my work, my life, as nothing more than a misguided hobby. Something to outgrow like a childhood phase. And as if on cue, Damien turned to me with his practiced grin. You know, Frey, if you ever get tired of pretending to save the planet, I could find you something entry-level. Maybe in PR. You always had a way with words. I stared at him, willing myself to feel nothing. Not the sting of betrayal. Not the rage simmering beneath my skin. Because this wasn't a surprise. Was it? It was the final, inevitable chapter in a lifetime of being overlooked, undervalued, and underestimated. But what Damien didn't know, what he could never predict, was that while he sat there basking in his victory, I was already holding something far greater than anything in my father's will. Something Mom had left me. Something that would change everything. So I smiled, calm, collected. That's generous, Damien, I said smoothly, rising from my chair, but I think I'll manage just fine. And I walked out, knowing full well that their world was about to crumble. They just didn't know it yet. The drive home felt longer than usual, the hum of the engine barely drowning out the thoughts racing through my head. I should have been used to it by now, being the outsider. The afterthought. But this wasn't just another slight. This was final. My father had spent his life making one thing clear. Power belonged to those who wielded it ruthlessly. And Damien, the perfect protégé, had absorbed every lesson. He hadn't just inherited the company. He had inherited the legacy of control, manipulation, and unchecked ambition that my father worshipped. I pulled into the driveway of my small but charming coastal home. A place my father had once dismissed as quaint, with a sneer. He had laughed at my choice to leave the boardroom behind for the ocean. For a life spent researching and protecting the environment rather than exploiting it. Idealistic nonsense, he called it. But Mom had understood. And now, as I stepped inside, I finally allowed myself to open the envelope she had left for me, the one I had promised not to read until after my father was gone. My hands trembled as I unfolded the letter, her familiar handwriting pulling me back to a time when I still felt seen. Valued. My dearest Freya, if you're reading this, then your father has done exactly as I feared. But I need you to know something. While he built Morgan Enterprises, I was building something of my own. And I built it for you. I swallowed hard, flipping through the stack of documents beneath the letter. At first, my brain struggled to process what I was seeing. Financial statements, investment portfolios, ownership certificates. It was an empire, hidden in plain sight. Mom had spent decades investing in sustainability, in groundbreaking environmental technologies, and unlike Morgan Enterprises, which was now shackled to Damien's outdated vision, this was thriving. And it was all in my name. A slow, steady smile formed on my lips. My father had given Damien the past. Mom had given me the future. And I had every intention of using it. I sat at my dining table, surrounded by the weight of my mother's foresight. Stacks of documents, digital portfolios, and legal filings sprawled before me like a map of a kingdom I never knew I had inherited. She had built this, brick by quiet brick, while my father and Damien played their games of corporate power. She had been preparing me for this moment, even when I thought I was standing alone. I wasn't alone. I had this. The Freya my father had dismissed, the dreamer, the idealist, the sentimentalist, wasn't the one who would handle this. No, this was the version of me forged in years of being overlooked, dismissed, and left behind. This was the Freya who had learned to fight for every inch of space in a world that told her she didn't belong. And Damien? He had no idea what was coming. I spent the next 2 days barely sleeping, combing through every document, making calls to the people my mother had trusted to keep this empire alive. The investors, the scientists, the project managers, each of them spoke with admiration and respect for the woman my mother had been. And now, they were looking to me. It would have been easy to let the bitterness consume me, to focus only on revenge. But my mother didn't build this out of spite, she built it out of hope. She believed in something bigger, something that could change the world for the better. And I was not going to let her down. By the end of the week, I had assembled a plan, a real one, not just for taking back what I deserved, but for shaping a legacy that would outlive the shadow my father and Damien had cast. I was done playing the forgotten daughter. I was done being the afterthought. I was going to take the future my mother had given me and build something unstoppable. And if my father's golden son thought he had already won? He was about to learn exactly what I was capable of. The day I confronted Damien felt like the moment before a storm, the air thick with expectation. The sky heavy with the weight of something inevitable. Except this wasn't a storm that would sweep me away. I was the storm. I arrived at Morgan Industries headquarters dressed for war. A sleek black suit, tailored to perfection, heels that clicked like a countdown with every step, and a confidence that was no longer borrowed, but wholly mine. As I strode through the marble-floored lobby, the receptionist barely had time to stammer out a greeting before I swept past her, heading straight for the top floor. Damien was waiting. He sat behind our father's desk, his desk now. In his mind, leaning back like a king on his throne. He barely hid his smirk as he saw me. Freya, he drawled, feigning surprise. Didn't expect to see you here so soon. Did you need help finding a job? Maybe something entry-level? I smiled, slow and sharp. Actually, I came to talk about your future. He frowned, just a flicker, but enough for me to see it. I pulled a thick folder from my bag and dropped it onto the desk between us. "What's this?" he asked, eyeing it like it might bite. "Leverage." The moment he flipped it open, his smirk vanished. Inside were years of carefully compiled reports, documents my mother had secured. Emails, financial records, every unethical deal he had signed off on, every decision that put profit over integrity. And at the very bottom, proof that our father had funneled company money into personal accounts under Damien's name, setting him up for a fall if things ever went south. Damien paled. "Where did you get this?" I leaned in, lowering my voice to a whisper. "Mom was smarter than you ever gave her credit for." For the first time in his life, Damien looked afraid. I straightened, reclaiming my space, my power. "You have two options, Damien. Step down quietly and let me take over. Or I take this public. And you become the scandal that destroys everything." Silence stretched between us, thick with his disbelief. Then, with gritted teeth and fists clenched at his sides, Damien asked, "What do you want?" I smiled. "Everything." The moment Damien signed the resignation papers, I felt something shift deep within me. Years of being overlooked, dismissed, and underestimated unraveled in an instant. I had won. Damien sat across from me in our father's old office. His jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might crack. His signature gleamed in bold black ink across the bottom of the document, the same ink that severed his claim to everything he had taken for granted. For years, he had strutted through these halls, wielding his power like a sledgehammer, crushing anyone who dared to stand in his way. And yet, here he was, stripped of it all, reduced to nothing more than a man who had finally been outplayed. I leaned back in my chair, savoring the silence. I always wondered what this moment would feel like, I mused, tapping my nails against the polished mahogany desk, the real throne of Morgan Industries. Turns out, it's even better than I imagined. Damien's glare could have cut through steel. "You think this makes you better than me?" he spat. I tilted my head, letting my victory settle over me like a well-tailored coat. "No, Damien," I said, my voice laced with satisfaction. "I know it does." He shot up from his seat, shoving the papers across the desk like they burned his hands. "This isn't over." I smirked. "Oh, but it is." I gestured to the security guards waiting at the door. "Escort Mr. Pierce out of the building." Damien's face burned red as the guards flanked him. He yanked his arm away when one reached for him. But he didn't fight. He knew better. As he disappeared through the doors, I let out a slow, satisfied breath. For years, he had controlled the game. But today, I rewrote the rules. I turned my chair toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking the empire that was now mine. For the first time in my life, I was exactly where I was meant to be. And damn, did it feel good. The first day as CEO of Morgan Industries felt like stepping into a battlefield where every glance was a silent challenge. Every handshake a test of dominance. The tension in the boardroom was palpable, thick with uncertainty and veiled resentment. These men, my father's old allies, Damien's former enablers, sat around the conference table with forced smiles, their polished shoes tapping against the floor as they measured me with their cold, skeptical eyes. I met their gazes without flinching. "Let's get one thing clear," I said, my voice smooth but unyielding. "Morgan Industries is not Damien's playground anymore. The days of reckless spending, backroom deals, and short-sighted leadership are over." A few men shifted uncomfortably, their fingers tightening around their pens. One of them, a senior executive who had been Damien's right hand for years, scoffed under his breath. "And what exactly do you plan to do differently?" His tone dripped with condescension, the unspoken words hanging between us. "You don't belong here." I leaned forward, placing both hands on the table. "Everything." The room went silent. They had expected hesitation, uncertainty, weakness. They had expected me to play nice. to fumble my way through this transition while they pulled the strings behind the scenes. But they had underestimated me. I pulled up the financial reports I had been analyzing for weeks, highlighting the waste, the mismanagement, the blatant disregard for sustainability and long-term strategy. This company has been hemorrhaging money under Damien's leadership. Profits were high, yes, but they came at the cost of integrity and innovation. That changes today. The room was no longer filled with smug amusement. Now, there was something else, something closer to fear. I will make Morgan Industries stronger than it has ever been, I continued, my tone unwavering. You can either get on board, or you can get out. A long silence stretched before one of the younger board members, a man I knew had quietly opposed Damien's tactics, nodded. I'm with you. One by one, the others followed. I exhaled slowly, letting the weight of the moment settle. This was my company now, my rules, my future. And I was just getting started. For the first time in my life, I was free. Free from the weight of my father's expectations. Free from Damien's shadow. Free from the chains of a legacy that was never meant to be mine. But instead of walking away, I was taking control, not just of Morgan Industries, but of my own destiny. The boardroom belonged to me now. The empire my father had built, the one Damien had nearly destroyed, was under my command, but I wasn't here to play by their rules. I was here to rewrite them. The first major change came swiftly, severing the toxic ties Damien had cultivated. The old board members, the ones who had looked the other way while he drained the company dry, were replaced. The contracts he had manipulated were reevaluated, renegotiated, and in some cases, obliterated entirely. Most importantly, I made it clear to every executive, every investor, and every employee that the days of power being hoarded by a privileged few were over. I stepped onto the factory floor, shaking hands with workers who had spent years being overlooked. I sat in on research meetings with the engineers who had ideas but never the funding to bring them to life. I listened to people who had been silenced under Damien's reign, and then I gave them a voice. Empowerment wasn't just a slogan, it was a revolution. And I wasn't just here to lead it. I was here to embody it. I stood in front of a crowd of employees gathered for the company's first ever open forum. My presence alone sent a message. This company, I said, voice steady, is not just mine, it's ours. From the mailroom to the boardroom, from the interns to the executives, we are in this together. A ripple of electricity ran through the room. For the first time, they saw a leader who wasn't looking down on them, but standing beside them. I had taken control of my life, my future, my power, and I would never let anyone take it from me again. The invitation arrived in an envelope so thick and embossed with gold that it reeked of excess. The Morgan Legacy Gala, it read, as though the empire Damien had almost ruined was still something to be celebrated. I held it between my fingers, considering the irony. Just months ago, I had been the forgotten daughter, the disappointment. Now, I was the one who had pulled the company back from the brink. The one who had transformed it into something sustainable, forward-thinking, unstoppable, and yet, the invitation still bore his name as the host. I smiled. Let him think he's still in control. Let him believe this night belongs to him. The gala was held in the grand ballroom of the city's most exclusive hotel, marble floors polished to a mirror finish. Chandeliers casting a golden glow over a crowd of elites sipping champagne and trading empty pleasantries. Damien stood at the center, flashing his signature smirk, surrounded by those who still clung to the old ways. I made my entrance deliberately late. Eyes turned toward me as my heels clicked against the marble. I let them stare, let them whisper. My presence alone was a reminder that the tides had shifted, that Damien's reign had crumbled beneath him. He saw me and stiffened, quickly masking his unease with a smirk. Freya, he drawled, extending a hand, didn't think you'd show. I accepted his handshake, gripping just tight enough to make him sweat. Why would I miss this? It's the end of an era. After all. Damien's smile faltered. You always did love your theatrics. I returned his smirk. I learned from the best. And then, as if on cue, the night took the turn I had orchestrated. The whispers in the room grew louder. Eyes flicked toward their phones. Screens lit up with breaking news. A public announcement, official, irrefutable. Morgan Industries had formally severed its last tie to Damien. His bank accounts? Frozen. His shares? Revoked. His influence? Gone. His face drained of color as he checked his phone. I leaned in, lowering my voice so only he could hear. Enjoy the party, Damien. It's the last one you'll ever host. I walked away, leaving him in the ruins of his once perfect world. The day of reckoning had arrived, wrapped in the kind of poetic justice that even the best storytellers couldn't script. Damien had spent years sitting at the head of the table, reveling in his control, basking in the unwavering power of his last name. But today, that name no longer carried the weight he had once wielded like a weapon. Today, it was a liability. The boardroom was silent, save for the ticking of the antique clock that had once belonged to my father. The same clock Damien had sat beneath when he signed away my inheritance years ago. Convinced I was too insignificant to fight back. Now, he sat beneath it once more, except this time. It was his fate being decided. Damien Morgan, the chairman announced, clearing his throat. This emergency session has been called to address recent developments concerning your leadership. After reviewing financial records, operational failures, and your deliberate obstruction of sustainable business strategies, we have come to a decision. Damien leaned back in his chair, feigning indifference, but his grip on the table betrayed him. He was waiting for a lifeline, for someone to stand up and defend him. No one did. With a unanimous vote, the chairman continued, the board has chosen to remove you as CEO of Morgan Industries. Effective immediately. Damien stiffened, for the first time in his life. There was no backdoor escape. No loophole to exploit. His name wouldn't save him. His charm wouldn't work. This was justice, handed down by the very people he had once manipulated. I sat across from him, my expression unreadable, but inside, I savored the moment. This wasn't just revenge. This was balance being restored. As security arrived to escort him out, he turned to me, eyes burning with fury. This isn't over, Freya. I tilted my head, smiling. Oh, but it is. You just never saw it coming. I watched him leave, his footsteps heavy with the weight of his downfall. Then, I turned to the board and took my place at the head of the table, the seat he had once stolen from me. Poetic justice, indeed. The aftermath of Damien's fall was a whirlwind, but I had never felt so steady. The power shifts, the legal battles, the desperate attempts by former allies to claw back control, it all played out like a high-stakes game of chess. And for the first time, I was the one calling checkmate. The day after Damien was officially removed from Morgan Industries, I walked into my new office. His old one, the space still smelled of his expensive cologne, a lingering ghost of his arrogance. I didn't sit in his chair right away. Instead, I walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows, taking in the skyline he once believed he ruled. Miss Morgan, my assistant, Rachel, knocked hesitantly. The board is waiting. I turned, taking one last look at the remnants of Damien's empire before stepping out and into my own. The meeting was short. The board, shaken from the scandal but eager for stability, unanimously voted for a new direction, one aligned with sustainability, ethical business, and long-term growth, the very things my mother had championed before she was silenced. As I left the boardroom, I spotted Damien's former right-hand man, Connor Vale, leaning against the wall, arms crossed. You played the long game, he admitted, a slow smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Didn't think you had it in you. I met his gaze head-on. That was your first mistake. Underestimating me. He let out a low chuckle, pushing off the wall. And your next move? I exhaled slowly, a knowing smile creeping onto my lips. turning this company into something worth building. Something Damien never had the vision for. Connor nodded, an unspoken understanding passing between us. That night, I stood on my balcony, the city glowing beneath me, alive with endless possibility. I had spent years being overlooked, cast aside, treated as nothing more than an afterthought. But now, I was exactly where I was meant to be. Not because I had stolen Damien's throne. Because I had built my own. 1 year later, I stood before a packed auditorium, the room humming with anticipation. Cameras lined the back wall, reporters poised with notebooks and recorders, waiting for the story that would define the next era of business. But today wasn't about press coverage or shareholder expectations. Today was about something bigger. I took a deep breath and stepped up to the podium. The Morgan Industries logo displayed behind me, though now. It looked different, sleeker, bolder, more aligned with the future I had built. Thank you all for being here. I began, my voice steady, carrying across the room with a confidence I had earned. A year ago, this company was on the brink, not just financially, but morally. It had become a relic of outdated practices, driven by short-term greed rather than long-term impact. I paused, letting the truth settle, but that's not who we are anymore. The screen behind me lit up with the latest project, a global initiative for sustainable infrastructure, clean energy, and ocean preservation, the kind of innovation my mother had envisioned, the kind my brother scoffed at. We are not just rebuilding this company. We are redefining what success looks like. Applause erupted, but I wasn't finished. This is for the visionaries who were told they weren't good enough. For those who were dismissed, underestimated, and cast aside. This is proof that integrity wins, that resilience matters, and that when we refuse to accept the limits others place on us, we create something unstoppable. I stepped back as the standing ovation began. This wasn't just my triumph. It was the beginning of something far greater than me. And for the first time, I knew, this was only the start.